Welcome to the Fighting on Film podcast, the podcast all about classic and obscure war movies, from the Normandy landings to the days of chivalry and swords. If it's been captured on film, we're going to try and cover it. I'm Robbie of RM Military History.
I'm Matthew Moss of Historical Firearms and the Armourer's Bench.
Hello again, welcome back to the Fighting on Film podcast, and today we bring you another exclusive guest. We are joined by one of our Patreons for the first time. Welcome Andy Moody to the show.
Oh, hi guys, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
It's our pleasure. Andy's with us today because he's undertaking a master's on Britain in the First World War at Wolverhampton University, and his dissertation is on First World War cinema. So today he's going to be taking us through the immediate post-war era of the 20s and the 30s, and we're going to look at a section of that cinematic era and pick out some films from that era and talk about how they fit in with our social or cultural understanding of the First World War. Andy, please take it away.
Okay, so I'm been a lifelong film fan, and I started my dissertation, my master's in Britain in the First World War, coming up for 2 years ago. When I was thinking about doing my dissertation, it was a bit of a no-brainer, really, that I'd choose the cinema. The title of it is "Shooting the Great War: The First World War in Popular Cinema, Establishment of Myth and Sustaining Collective Memory," which sounds a bit pretentious, and it sounds as I'm pitching for a fairly highbrow article in Sight and Sound, which I may well be doing next year. But I'm really coming at this from a couple of angles, really. One is I think cinema is, undoubtedly the most important popular cultural medium, certainly the first half of the 20th century, and it's been so crucial in shaping our understanding of history. When people think of events, they quite often think of the cinematic version they've seen rather than the documentary.
Definitely.
My view, I guess my thesis is that about the Great War, the general public kind of hasn't as much, and a lot of that memory, that understanding has been fixed by cinematic images. We think of, oh, what a lovely war, the cynicism of people being sent off senselessly to their deaths, and I guess War Horse and various other. It's kind of fixing an image in people's minds that perhaps doesn't reflect how we think about it now. And this is a bit of it's kind of ambitiously, I'm going to be looking at the cinema in the last 100 years, from the end of the war to present day, probably taking it up to 1917 if I can manage to squeeze it in. But I think for this period, I thought it'd be really interesting to look at what happened in the immediate post-war era. And I think it's interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that people had just been through this cataclysmic experience. It had shaped how society sort of felt about itself. There were huge changes in, cultural changes with class and with gender, and a lot of things were up for grabs, and it had been incredibly traumatic. There was a start of memorialization. People were starting to think about, well, how do we remember this experience, and how do we commemorate it, and make sense of it all, really. And here was this popular medium. It was a modern medium. It wasn't like theatre or literature, if you like. It was accessible.
Yeah.
Even before the start of the war, there were 14,000 working cinemas. It had overtaken music hall as the popular entertainment of the working class. So its reach was absolutely huge. And I think, for me, how the war was represented in the immediate post-war era, in the silent era, if you like, is really important, because people at that time, people didn't have fixed ideas about the lines led by donkeys and people going off to senseless slaughter for a war that meant nothing.
Yeah. Like those popular history books now hadn't been written. They had their thoughts and what they'd been through, what they were basing it off, and these movies come through and they sort of push this.
Yeah.
They start to form a narrative, and they start to form our way we think of the First World War, coming straight in off it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's why any film which challenges the sort of received wisdom, is really difficult. And cinemas as a commercial medium. So people don't make films if they're not going to resonate with what the people what the people want, what people expect. So it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. People have their ideas of the First World War fixed in their mind. They want to see a representation of that which reflects what they believe to be the facts. And I think another important thing is that the Second World War changed a lot of that as well, because the Second World War very, very rightly, I think, fits into the good war narrative. If it took a war to destroy Nazism and Japanese militarism, then absolutely. But that question is, for us now, is a little more nuanced about the First World War. At the time, people were very clear. It was about preserving national freedom. It was about fighting, the attempted German domination of Europe and all the rest of it. And contemporary audiences going to the cinema in the 1920s would view the war that they'd just been through in the same way that people in the 1950s would have viewed the Second World War when they went to the cinema. So and we know what the cinema of the 1950s was like. The Sink the Bismarck and the kind of prison escape films, the Wooden Horse, and all that kind of stuff. It kind of reinforces what a nation felt about itself and about its own experience. And I think a couple of things that I thought would be really interesting to look at. There was a company called British Instructional Films, and I think the clue's a bit in the title, really. They saw their mission to kind of instruct people and show what the war was like from in a way that people would understand. It was this idea that national history is the stories we like to tell ourselves about ourselves, and the ones that I thought would be good to look at. There were a few, but Ypres and in 1925, and followed by Mons in 1926, which covered the initial few months, the retreat from Mons.
If we go to Mons second, I think we should start with the movie that sort of kicked it all off. Geoffrey Malins' Battle of the Somme, because they feed directly into each other, I think. I mean, Andy, be the expert on it.
Well, I wouldn't call myself an expert. I did part of the course. You get to choose a class presentation to do every academic year, and the one for this year was included the Battle of the Somme film, and I obviously chose that because I was planning, I think, from day one to do my dissertation on cinema, and I thought, it's a film that lasts an hour and 10 minutes. I mean, how difficult can it be? I didn't realize I'd end up watching it 6 times, read 2 books, several articles.
Only 6?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, it wasn't quite as easy, quite an easy dodge as I was hoping. And I think I'd seen it on the TV several years ago, and my understanding of it was probably shaped by the idea that half of it was fake, and there's the famous scene of the guys coming up the trenches and what have you, and didn't really see what had been achieved by the film and the cultural impact and how important it was. Malins and McDowell are two. I guess you call them embedded. They were like modern embedded kind of video journalists, I guess. Because before the army was incredibly suspicious, and people in government were thinking, well, do we want to show people at home what's going on? Because by 1915, it was pretty apparent that this was something of a bloodbath. Would the public accept it? Do we want them getting under our feet, essentially? But that had relaxed at the end of 1915, and cameramen were allowed near the front and could film. These guys were incredibly skillful, incredibly brave. The equipment they were using, they looked like small wooden suitcases on tripods. They weren't mobile. There was no zoom. They could pan from left to right. The hand cranked, so they're winding the cameras all the time. Their technical limitations on what they could achieve were considerable. But the big thing for me is that it is really important, because it's the first time the public had seen their army on the screen. So what we'd had a situation by the middle of 1916. We've got a mass citizen army for the first time in our history, the very first time. We've got huge numbers of people in the army from across all sections of society, which had never happened before. And this is a way of the government showing the citizen army to its citizens, saying, these men have gone off, they've joined the Pals battalions or what have you, and this is them. This is where they are, and this is what they're doing. and it was incredibly important from that point of view. And then the results were a bit uncertain at first. Would there be a public appetite for this? Nobody knew. Turns out 20 million people went to see it, the highest proportion of the population that had seen a film, which is a record which still stands to this day. It was absolutely incredible. Cinemas were they couldn't make enough prints. Cinemas were running it, week after week.
So I've got a excerpt from the Yorkshire Evening Post from Wednesday, the 6th of September 1916. And they say, the Battle of the Somme film, it appears, was taken by two operators, J.B. McDowell and J.H. Malins. Mr. Malins was responsible for about 1/3 of the whole before the big offensive began in July. A section of these films have been shown in the picture theatres, but the greater part has been reserved for use of the general headquarters. Many of the pictures were taken from positions that were exposed to the photographer could be seen by enemy troops.
Yeah, absolutely. A large box on a tripod looks very similar to a machine gun, right? Yeah. So it's gonna attract back. Actually, Mellins had one of his tripod legs broken off by a piece of shrapnel. McDowell won an MC later in the war. These guys who they really did put their lives on the line taking this film. So what they actually achieved was something quite remarkable, and it was accidental as well. It was never planned as a feature length. It was planned as they were going to take shorts. They were going to be shown in cinemas, maybe 10, 15 minutes long. That's why the film looks a bit kind of episodic and disjointed in terms of its narrative.
I can't remember the chap who edited it, but he was known as a bit of a quick editor, wasn't he? I can't remember the name.
There was Charles Urban was the editor on it, and William F. Jury was the producer. And they were essentially looking at the rushes and thinking, you know what, we could stitch this together and make a feature length film out of it. And it was a real punt because nobody knew if there was going to be an appetite for it or whether it would work or not. And I think that the strength of the film is that, in spite of all the limitations, and bearing in mind these were static cameras who didn't have zoom and what have you, they managed to take some incredibly iconic pictures. They moved location. Malins went through a tunnel to go and film. I think it's Lancashire Fusiliers in the Sunken Lane, where they went, as a jump-off point on the 1st of July. They got the Hawthorne mine going off. The guy the wounded soldier who's been brought in on the back of it. These are absolutely iconic. First of all, books are absolutely littered. The front covers of stills from the film, and that's a remarkable achievement. I think if anybody had filmed what had happened and managed to come away with a couple of images, I guess, that they would be happy with, then great. These guys got a good half a dozen, 10 images which have been used and used and used over and over again.
Yeah, if you had £1 for every time you've seen the shot of those lads going over that.
Oh my goodness,
that ridge line there.
Yeah.
They're the iconic photo. I can't tell you how many times I've seen the silhouette of that chap.
Yeah.
With his, walking away from camera. That it's like an iconic image of the First World War. Yet I find it really ironic that it's not. It's a recreation in a training camp in France.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they filmed what was possible, and what was possible was filming lots of film of guns going off. There's every different caliber of gun that was used during the initial bombardment, and that was absolutely fine. They could do that. What they couldn't do was they couldn't go over the top with the men. They couldn't. There's like an L-shaped junction at one point, which is used in several parts of the film, which is used to show guys going into the attack. That's a 29th Division, I think.
The sweeping of the ridge, because they cut that. There's an extended sequence of that where lads start dropping and they cut. So somewhere there's an extended sequence of probably more men getting mown down, but I think that's the only section of the movie where you can physically see someone getting killed.
You do see quite a few bodies littered around, and they don't shy away from showing some of the reality of war, which struck me when I rewatched it recently for this chat. I was quite surprised. We see there's a sequence where they're forming up, but there's still bodies on the ground where they're about to move off or I think it might be. I think it's a unit passing through a unit which is already consolidated, and there's still guys on the ground because the casualty collection hasn't gotten to them yet.
There's a really interesting section where a battery of 18-pounder field guns are moving up, and there's a couple of bodies. One's a Highlander in a kilt, and they're basically going round them, and these bodies have been left there. And there's a casualty in the bottom of a trench, which is quite clearly a British soldier. They didn't repeat that. There was some concern that they'd included casualties. There's a scene where there's quite a few German dead bodies, but they didn't tend to repeat that. And even during the Second World War, that was quite heavily edited and dead.
Yeah, I was going to say that it surprised me that for that exact reason, because as you say, come Second World War, there's a reluctance to show that mortality, the reality of war. But I mean, saying that, the film, when you watch the film, you get no idea of the 60,000 killed and wounded on the first day. You get no inclination that the losses were so heavy on that first day or so. Which kind of offsets that reality of war. But saying that, he may not have been present for it. He may have known it, or it may have been a conscious decision not to show it.
Quite quickly after filming because of what he saw, and he got back to London to get the film processed and made. And he went back a few times, but then he got quite ill and couldn't continue filming. So I think he was truly affected by what he saw, and it just had to have some time out of the line, because he'd been filming with the French and the Belgians since the start of the war, so he was probably quite fatigued. Perhaps evidence to suggest that he did have PTSD, of what we would now call it, from what he'd been seeing. So possible he just needed time out for his mental well-being. But there's no doubt that he sets the bar for documentary films going forward. And without Malins, our way that war is filmed, the nucleus of that is set with Malins and McDowell and these men. So without knowing it, they invent a genre without knowing it. It's incredible.
Yeah, absolutely they do.
That's what I wanted to ask. I wanted to ask Andy, how do you see Malin's work sort of paving the way for things like Somme's Mons and Ypres? Those kind of productions where it's a much more fictionalized depiction of war.
As you say, it kind of invented the genre of the war movie. It was a piece of wartime propaganda. It was very brave, and when it came out, I mean, it was kind of rush released. Really, it was in cinemas in August, and by that time, people were aware that Britain was in the war in a big way now. I mean, the First World War started in September 1914, but we weren't really in it in a kind of industrial European level until July 1916, and then we were never out of it until November 1918. So people were aware of what was going on, and as you say, it kind of set the tone of what was. I think looking at Ypres and Mons, from the British instructional films, the battle reconstruction films as they're now described. That kind of set the template, and there were fictional reproductions of what McDowell and Malins had actually created in real life. Apart from the sequences that link the bits together, I think the over the top sequences which we know was filmed at, we think, Third Army Mortar School. Which it's quite funny in a way. I mean, one of the acting, one of the guys is shot down and he crosses his legs after he's been shot. He's so chilled about it, and it's looking back now, we think
he looks back at the camera at one stage.
Exactly, exactly.
Looking at Malins.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, you can imagine these Tommies who would say, right, well, either you could have another day on the tubes, or you could do drill or whatever. Or do you fancy taking part as extras? Little kind of, and it was like a morning off, wasn't it? I guess. But then it's immediately followed by that sequence you said, Matt, about seeing the guys in kind of far distance and little black dots. You see them, and they're falling over. It's possibly the Newfoundland Regiment, but or I'm not sure just off the top of my head, but that's for real, you know. But it set the template not just for war movies, but for war documentaries as well, you know. So I don't know. I've watched as I think you guys have the Netflix documentary about the Hollywood film directors who went, you know, 5 came back, you know, who went off to absolutely amazing, absolutely amazing. And those guys are doing everything that McDowell and Maylands did. You know, they are following in that tradition. And I think the thing that surprised me is that the much lauded Battle of San Pietro, which John Huston did, faked. He did exactly the same thing as Maylands did. You know, I'd seen that film before, and I thought, God, this looks so realistic. But you know, 36th Division U.S. infantry had already moved on by then. You know, so he had to reproduce that. And do you know something? I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with that. I think sometimes you can't capture what happened, but you can reproduce it. You can capture the kind of essence of it.
Well, it's become bread and butter for documentaries, hasn't it? Now, where you often get those recreations.
Yeah, we just take that as normal now, don't we? We don't question it. So obviously, you know, Maylands' Battle of the Somme is a game changer, and come the post-war period of the 20s, we see a glut of these battle recreation movies, and I think the first one that Andy tipped us off on to check out was 1925's Ypres.
Yeah, I mean, there were quite a few, and British Instructional Films was a company set up to do these kind of battle reconstructions. They if you like, they provide a link between documentary and pure drama. They use quite a lot of documentary footage as well, so that it's a mix of reconstruction, acting, and also documentary footage, which is spliced together. And I think they do that. I think they do that quite well. I guess Ypres is really important for kind of memorialization and people's remembrance of the First World War. One of Winston Churchill's more crazy schemes, and let's be honest, he had quite a few of them, was that the British government buys the remains of Ypres and leaves it as a wreck, as a permanent standing memorial to the British Army, because the army had been, since October 1914, had been based there. There'd been at least 3, possibly 4, if you include the 1918 battles, in the area, and it was a place every Tommy at some point would serve there. The battles weren't as big as the Somme, but that's where it is. That's where the Menin Gate is. It's a place of pilgrimage, you know. So it's really important. And there was and this film seeks to tell the story of all of the battles that happened around that area. So it goes from 1914 right the way through the war. And it's I think it's really interesting. There are lots of themes in it. One of the themes that they hit on that would resonate with people is telling people what they wanted to see in a lot of ways. It's quite sanitized. It emphasizes duty and sacrifice, bravery. There's lots of stories about VC winners included in there. They were quite often, these films were quite often released around the time of Armistice Day in November. It was seen as part of the traditional of memorialization and helping. I guess as we talked about before, it's people's feelings of the memory of their experience of the war was very different to the ones we have now. There wasn't the concept of the anti-war film. That would come in a lot later. So what we find in these films is very much the image of the war that people would find comfort in, that they would remind them of what they'd achieved. Because let's be honest, people had the war had touched most families. It's not true to say every family someone had died, but everyone probably knew a family that had somebody who died or been badly injured. Yeah. Like I said about the Somme being a citizen army, what the armies were like John Bourne called the British working man in uniform, and it was an experience which went right the way through society, and people were quite proud of what they'd achieved. There wasn't really a public mood for the kind of negative aspect of people's understanding of it. So these films would reproduce that. A number of episodes which included the counterattack of the Second Worcesters at the Battle of Gallivelt in the First Ypres, led by Charles Fitzclarence, who was one of these crazy brave pre-war professional officers. One of my lecturers, Spencer Jones, does a brilliant lecture about him. He was called the Demon, and it was a very you didn't have to dramatize it too much of the kind of things this guy would do, which was lead very much from the front. Because I think another one of those, and it kind of lapses into cliches a little bit, but we get the recurrent theme of the kind of brave officer sacrificing himself, leading his men, all the rest of it. It's actually not too far from the truth. If you held the King's Commission in 1914 and your reading material extended much beyond horse and hound, you were considered possibly a dangerous intellectual. You were expected to have read Clausewitz and understood it. But what you were expected to was first and foremost look after the welfare of your men, and second, to display absolute suicidal bravery on every occasion, and to be very casual about it as well. So this idea of officers leading from the front, coolly smoking a cigarette, saying it's getting frightfully hot around here as the kind of German bullets are whizzing by, is not too much of a cliche. And I think that film reflects that and what people would understand from that experience.
They're like a series of vignettes, aren't they? It's quite easy to process as a viewer even now. You don't have to know too much going in, so it can be appreciated by many age groups, and there's something for everyone. There's a heroic last stand, then there'll be like a more of a romantic sort of, oh, look at our brave Tommies helping out the French peasants and things like that. It not only is it trying to show the horrors of war, but it shows the British Army being quite the like really just nice people in general.
Absolutely,
There's no ill will to anybody. It's the dastardly Hun are dastardly, but look at our boys, they're so brave and dashing and nice. I don't get any sort of malice towards them.
Absolutely not.
No one's laying the blame for the war either. It's quite a refreshing way to view the war, I think, because there's none of this sort of, as you said at the start, there's no lions led by donkeys. There's no what was the point of it all.
No.
It is quite a clean view of the war, which I think is interesting in itself.
People weren't questioning the rights and wrongs of the war at this stage. I mean, the war poets were very influential, and as we find, when we get to Journey's End, people were looking at, and it was something that couldn't be denied. There were wounded people, wounded in body and in mind. Politically, wartime consensus, where everyone came together pretty much, had started to fracture again. So there were a lot of questions. I mean, it's really quite interesting in Ypres. There's a section talking about, I think it's the Messines Ridge when they're talking about the mining there, and there's one of the intertitle cards makes explicit mention of the miners from Wales, Northumberland, and Yorkshire, and the irony is that within a year the general strike would be on, and these very same men would be the enemies within, to use Margaret Thatcher's phrase from the 1980s, but at the time they were heroes. They were part of the war effort, and they were lauded for what they achieved. But I think the film is really interesting. There's it's a shame. There are lots of different versions of this because a few people have written quite a lot about silent cinema and the Great War. Lawrence Napper is a film academic, has written a brilliant book called The Great War and Popular British Cinema of the 1920s, and makes the point that actually there are a number of prints of this around, and they're like any old film. There are missing sections, and so what we have is what we can find at the moment. I think it struggles sometimes to portray what we understand, particularly around the Third Battle of Ypres, Passchendaele. The cards, the title cards mention the terrible conditions and the mud, yet it's completely dry when you see the film, and there's dust everywhere.
Yeah,
and that's not how we remember it.
Yeah.
And I think it kind of fails from that perspective. I think seeing the tanks in action is brilliant, but I think anybody who knows anything about Third Ypres knows that the tanks were an absolute catastrophe because the conditions were so bad. But if we kind of think about an alley tally, using the unditching beam on the Mark IV tank was a highlight for me. I mean, I was absolutely made up with that. It was super.
Again, it's stuff that you see used over and over again. It's those kind of things pop up and people go, "Oh, that's real."
Yeah.
And that's one of the problems with Mons and Ypres. People just sort of assume that these recreations are real, especially Mons.
Yeah.
There's numerous documentaries that seem to have done. Not so much recently, but I can remember as a kid watching documentaries, and they'd have that famous sequence of the guys lining a slightly sunken road, and the officers being handed an SMLE.
Warwalks cuts in a lot of Mons.
Yeah. And it's understandable because there's almost no photography from that period of the war at all, really.
No. I mean, Mons is it predates the Gamalians and McDowell being allowed to be at the front. It was the end of 1915 when the army said, "Look, we need to show people at home what these guys are doing and where they are." And it's useful propaganda, a fairly untrustworthy medium, which is pretty new to.
Yeah, they didn't see the merit in it, did they? They thought it was like a working class pursuit. There's no want or need to film the British Army, apart from a few instructional training films they'd made themselves internally. But they didn't think there was any want for it. But it does make me wonder what Malins would have captured if he'd have been there, because the stuff he captures with the French and the Belgians, I can't remember the name of the movie. I think it's like the Battle of Lair. Oh crikey, I can't remember the one. But he made a film about the French. I think it was like 1915 release, and that proved to the War Office that Malins' work is really good. Let's get him in. The only downfall for me with Mons was I spent more time thinking, okay, that's actually from Mons. Then that's not just a recreated bit of film. Because obviously I know that it wasn't real footage of Mons when I watched these documentaries, but I think I just spent more time going, okay, that's from Mons then. Sort of it's a little bit like Battle of the Somme, where all those little clips and sequences you've seen spread out are actually just from Malins' Somme film. They're not from 1914. They're not from earlier in the war. So I just think that's really interesting that only about maybe 3 of these movies are responsible for almost all of the contemporary footage we think of when we think of the First World War. I think that's just insane.
Yeah, completely. I mean, it's that provides us with so much material. Anyone who's watched the 1960s TV series, The Great War, it's ubiquitous. It's absolutely everywhere. I mean, I guess the only thing you couldn't use is guys with Brody helmets in 1914, because it wouldn't fly. But I think the interesting thing for me is that I guess this kind of cinema sensibility was still developing at this time. The camera work was very static. A lot. There was the cameras were fixed, and the action would move into shot or it would move out of shot. The camera wouldn't necessarily follow the action, so you'd get the cameraman setting up something, and it remained pretty static. There were very few close-ups, no zoom. There's no kind of like dolly shots where actually turns out in Mons there are a couple where the camera's moving with the troops who are marching, but in Ypres there's nothing like that. And so you get scenes where I guess we're all familiar with these kind of Victorian era last stand paintings, Isandwana, or the
Lady Butler-esque
absolutely
sort of stuff, isn't it?
And there's a scene at the end of Ypres where there's a guy, he's got a bandage around his head, he's holding his rifle, and he's standing there proud, holding back and the German advance, and there's Ypres in the background as a wreck, and it could be taken from a painting, and it's that kind of tradition of the last stand, the heroic kind of Tommy who will fight to the final round, which I think people would recognise from prints, in hanging on the wall or what have you, but it wasn't the sort of language of cinema that was much more dynamic and fast moving that you'd see, say, for example, in the Big Parade, which we're going to talk about. But that was, for me, was a characteristic of these films, is they're still not quite using the language of cinema that I guess the art form, if you like, can provide you.
It's very matter of fact, isn't it? It's very matter of fact filmmaking. It's like, here's what I've read. Here's how the battle goes. That's your lot. Its sense of scale is really impressive.
Yeah.
The amount of men on screen at any one given time. The fact that a lot of these men were serving and probably had fought, on the Western Front themselves, and it's a little bit like Theirs Is the Glory, where just that extra layer of professionalism from the cast, from their professional jobs as soldiers, it comes through on screen. I really enjoyed seeing the officers lean into their shots with their rifles, and just how men were sort of it just looks so natural, and I think that almost lifts the film. I can forgive it for being quite long, and some scenes just feel like this a bit you've already just seen.
Exactly.
How many men being swarmed by Germans do we need? It's not the fault. It's not the filmmaker's fault, because they're just trying to show you what's happening. But
the thing with Mons is it's blow by blow.
Yeah.
It's like it is literally the entire first 100 days of World War One from the British perspective.
And imagine trying to get that off the ground now.
You would never do it. Even as a series, it would never happen. So I think Mons especially is my favorite of most of these that we've looked at for this particular chat, because it combines so many interesting things. You've got action sequences where bridges are being blown, houses are falling down. You've got contemporary footage of Sir John French is spliced in. Smith Dorrien pops up in a cameo.
Amazing.
Which is incredible. You just and it goes all the way from the first sort of cavalry skirmish straight through to the batteries dueling at Narey. It's literally goes straight through, and the cinematography of it is really impressive. And it struck me that it pushes a lot of boundaries, even as you mentioned, Andy, compared to Ypres. It pushes it, because there's dolly shots, there's lots of close-up work, there's practical effects going on, there are reaction shots, there's as I mentioned, there's the splicing in of contemporary footage, and then there's bringing in people who are actually there, not only the people portraying the actions, but also Smith Dorrien.
Really nice too.
Yeah,
especially I think one of my favourite sequences, the bit where the officers getting handed the loaded rifles. I really like just the way that's shot there. We're seeing all the men up the line fighting. It is like a painting. It reminds me of those famous Mons paintings of men firing over ditches and those
hats on backwards, tunics open. I
love seeing marching pattern 08. It's so good. It's it's sort of fighting in it because it's
there's an attention to detail to it all, isn't there? And that's the impressive part. They could have easily just put a load of lads in uniform and gone, well, there we go, that's it. But they've tried to include those little details, officers with the correct sword patterns, and
that's nice, isn't it?
The way that their puttees have come unraveled as they're marching, and these sort of emotive shots that they get. Because you mentioned, Rob, there's a load of scenes where they get swarmed, but there's also a heck of a lot of scenes where it's just close up to feet. And you can totally understand why they were doing that, because it is, it's probably the British Army's greatest retreat since Corunna in the peninsula. But it's an incredible film. And I think it possibly might be my favourite one of the ones that we've looked at. Just because it's such an interesting sort of footnote in how style developed.
I think you're absolutely right, Matt, to point this out. I mean, for me, Mons just takes it on in terms of quality, just another level. It uses a lot of it looks very realistic, as you say, Matt. The guys are working the bolts on the the SMLEs, and it looks absolutely 100% natural. The cavalrymen.
I love how many times you see Vickers guns with their top covered open.
Yeah,
in this film.
It's just amazing. And the cavalry as well. They're handling the horses really well. They're using the 08 cavalry sword, and that comes into action. We've got lancers. It's fantastic. I've got a couple of friends on the course who are like big into cavalry, so they would absolutely love that one. It's but I think in terms of its technicality, as you say, there are a few shots where there's obviously a camera on the back of a cart or a car which is following the soldiers moving. Which is, I mean, you watch enough of these films with the static cameras, and something like that happens, it absolutely jumps out at you.
It does.
It's just amazing. I think one of the things for me was one of my favourite sequences. You get the marching feet. It looks fuzzy and out of focus. It gives the impression of men marching as if they're asleep, which a lot of people, contemporary records would say, I didn't sleep for 3 days and I still marched kind of 30 miles and I can't remember it. And you get that impression of how weary it was. The bit where they get into St. Quentin, and Major Bridges he buys a toy drum from a toy shop. And he plays the drum, and he gets his bugler to play on a penny whistle to rouse the men, and it's hilarious. And it would be ridiculous if it wasn't actual facts. If that hadn't actually happened, you wouldn't believe it. But
the boxing match is a bit bizarre as well.
The boxing match is incredibly bizarre. But I think if we're talking about, we have to talk about it in a minute. But the thing to talk about is it's all about the kind of myth building as well, because what had happened in St. Quentin that time was something of a scandal. Is that two regular officers who were like colonels leading the Royal Warwicks and the Royal Dublin Fusiliers had agreed to surrender their commands and surrender the town. This chap Bridges comes up and says, "Oh, hang on a minute, we're not having any of that," and rouses the troops, and they continue the retreat. These two officers were court-martialed. They were cashiered, and Mannering retired. Elkington, absolutely in disgrace. He was a lieutenant colonel leading a battalion, regular officer. He's kicked out of the army in disgrace, and he joins the French Foreign Legion, and he fights with distinction. He wins a DSO, and he's given his command back. I think that's a fantastic story, but it doesn't.
Let's have a film of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it doesn't. It doesn't fit into the.
Starts with a cutscene of him looking at the mess weapon.
That's right. Yeah, that would be superb. I would love to see that, but that doesn't fit into the narrative of what we want to sort of think about what happened. So we get this great sequence of Bridges. He's playing the drums, and there's a fade in of a drummer in full dress uniform, and it's like you can imagine that.
That again is quite a technical thing for that point in cinema. So it fades in on the left-hand side of the screen. Yeah. It's like it's one of the guards bands. I think.
Yes, yeah. And it's evoking that, and you know that the cinema piano player is going to be playing the British Grenadiers or what have you when that's going on, and it's it's incredibly moving. I think technically it's a much better film. And I think had moved on. I think the little vignettes we get the Highlander who escapes from a burning windmill, the Germans have kind of locked him in and they're going to burn him. The beastly Hun and all the rest of it. He managed to get away. That's a good little bit of a human drama. But I think the thing you mentioned, Matt, about the boxing with the Lancashire soldier who finds a German cavalryman who's obviously got lost. And what's he going to do? Well, obviously in real life, he just shoots him and he carry on. But that's not the British way, is it? So they take the jackets off and have a boxing match, and he knocks him clean out. Nicks his bratwurst, is decent enough to leave him half, and he trundles off on his way, which I think is fantastic, because people would have a bit of a laugh at that, but they'd also recognise it as being, well, yeah, that's the British spirit. That's the British way. We're decent and we're fair and we're fighting straight up.
So it's subtly like showing how a nation has bested another nation as well. It's really subtle. Not subtle. It's quite blunt, but how showing the might of the country through a scene, whether that's the intention of the filmmaker or not. You can think in that contemporary way now, thinking, well, that's what you're trying to show, surely, through that sequence.
Yeah, and I think I think it works, and I think it's trying to bridge the gap between like a drama documentary and I guess making that human connection, between people and events, which only really pure drama can do. Which I guess would probably lead quite nicely onto the big parade, which came out in 1925. Yeah. It's a huge contrast because it's a big budget Hollywood production, and it looks it. It's pure drama. There's no pretense to being documentary. It's based on true events. It's written by Lawrence Stelling, who was a Marine veteran of the Battle of Belleau Wood. And so it's got that authenticity about it, but it's pure drama, and it was massively successful, incredibly influential. I think it shows a huge contrast between the American approach to representing the war and something the British domestic film industry was a bit reticent to embrace. Is it a subject which lends itself to melodrama, in fact, with a bit of romance in it? Is it an appropriate subject? We had that Mademoiselle for Armentières. There's a bit of The Guns of Loose, which has got a personal drama in it, but by and large, we kind of shied away from that kind of thing. I think the story as well, the angle it takes is quite American. The central character, Jim, who's a rich playboy, he ends up joining up with a couple of guys, Slim and Bull, who are working class characters. He joins up as a buck private, which if that was a British made film, he'd be an officer for sure, But he joins sort of 42nd Rainbow Division with them. He goes off to France, and it's really interesting. I mean, the first couple of I guess the first half of the film, possibly more of it, is establishing that connection with the audience and the lives of these individuals, so that you're seeing how the war affects human beings, because you've seen them laugh, you've seen them joke, you've seen them get into scrapes. Jim falls in love with a French girl, and there's that investment in their relationship, I guess. So when the casualties happen, they're happening to people that we've invested in on a human level, and I think that has a real impact. I think another thing for me is that it's a film that really uses the language of cinema in a way that the others didn't. There's a really incredible scene where Jim's unit has been called up and they're being transported to the front. And Melisande, his girlfriend, is looking for him. She's running up and down. And at one point, she's sandwiched in between two rows of moving traffic. In the foreground, there's marching men. In the background, there's trucks and carts, and she's in focus in the middle of these. And it's a very dynamic scene, and it's moving, and it's kind of it's quite thrilling in a way. And for me, that's embracing what was technically possible in I guess, without wanting to sound too pompous, the sort of cinematic art, which the big parade does show. There's there are lots of very good panoramic shots. The bit where the trucks are moving up, you've got the planes flying overhead. Yeah. It's showing the war on a huge scale, but at the same time on a very human level as well, which I think it pulls off really, really well. I don't know what you guys thought of the film. I really liked it.
Well, it starts off much the same, doesn't it? It's at that same sort of Hollywood level. It's D.W. Griffith's sort of scale sort of approach to things. He comes down the stairs in his family home, and it's huge. Yeah. It's palatial. And the film carries that on throughout, even, once they're in the field. The scope of the landscapes are much bigger than even Mons, where you get these really nice long shots. But with this, you see like 300-400 yards through the lines of trees when they're in in the woods, and you can see the guys moving forward through through the trees. And as you say, with that sequence, it goes on for such a long time as well. That sequence where they're looking for each other in the town, and they're all passing one another, and she's calling for him, and he's looking around, and there's everything's going on. You could literally just watch the background of that scene, and easily. It's a really interesting film, and in the grading of the film stock changes quite a bit as well. So that some of the scenes where the night fighting are got a bluish. I mean, that may depend on the print that you watch, but it seems to be more like almost a conscious sort of attempt. Perhaps in the Restorer that I watched, the version I watched, they've done that, but cinematically, you can see how it's from a different sort of school.
It's very impressive. I think I mean, I've seen All Quiet on the Western Front with those tints added to it. I mean, it's really good, as you say. I think it's a bluish. There's like a blue tint in the night scenes. I think when
there's a sepia on some of the scenes, and there's a blue, and I mean, to mention All Quiet on the Western Front, that's 5 years on, and that's from the German school of cinema, isn't it? So it's well, I'm thinking West Front there, but. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think, I mean, looking at when it actually does get to the battle sequence, it kind of starts off a bit unconvincing when they're walking through essentially the Hollywood Hills, and it's they're walking in straight lines, and the Germans don't look that kind of convincing, and they're throwing grenades that have like a massive effect. But
that's one of the scenes that I liked the scale of. But I know exactly what you mean. So the Germans are sort of like standing behind trees at one point. It's like they almost haven't bothered to dig a trench system for the sequence.
But when night falls, it really picks up. When it gets to night, it becomes more of a threatening environment. It becomes more there's more a sense of peril, and I think it looks more convincing.
It takes on a little bit of sort of. I mean, the period, this period for cinema is obviously characterized a lot by influence of surrealism, and the play between realism and surrealism, and it almost has an American slant on that at times, where it's very stark close-ups. There's flashes of light, which it lends itself to sort of portraying battle, I think, because battle is surreal because it's a situation that almost no one that isn't involved in a war would find themselves in or experience. But another scene I really love from the film is the scene where they're strafed in column.
Yes.
And it begins with the pilot's eye view, and he's cocking his machine gun. That's impressive to me. But,
I mean, there's a few sort of aerial scenes there, which I mean just demonstrated what was available then. It was a big budget, and they by mid-20s Hollywood was absolutely booming. They were making huge amounts of money, and I think as well the acting. I mean John Gilbert and René Adoré were fantastic in this film. They within the limitations of what was available in the kind of non-speaking era. I think they do a great job. I think the main cast of characters really do a great job of selling, the personalities involved, and you do have that investment in what happens to them. And I think at the end, the film climaxes obviously with Jim makes it home. And I think you could almost imagine when he walks into the drawing room you're talking about in his palatial home, and his mum and dad are there, and he's got this haunted look on his face when his dad's driving him home, and he's a guy who's been somewhere and seen something. Comes through, he walks through the door and he's got a leg missing, and you can just imagine the audience gasping at that point. The impact of that of someone, and obviously he's got his girlfriend at home, but luckily his brother's taken he's got one girlfriend too many, and handily his brother's helped him out with that. So he goes back and is reunited with Alessandra is French, Melisandre is his French girlfriend, and it finishes on a high note, but at the same time while we've not got into this, the era of, war is hell, it destroys lives, and there's no escaping the fact that two out of the three main characters that you'd invested in are dead, and one of them has had his leg shot off, and so war comes at a cost. It's not all heroics, lives are affected by this, but
it's a clear depiction of PTSD.
Sure, absolutely.
I mean, that sequence where he's in the hospital bed and the sequences in the car with his father, it's clear. I mean, it's probably, I suppose, one of the earliest depictions of that. I suppose I'm not au fait with, that side of academic study of PTSD on film, but this must be one of the earlier examples of that.
Absolutely, that completely surprised me as well, because I wasn't expecting that Jim would. The guy he sandwiched between two of the guys in the hospital, but one's clearly been through quite a bit. He's got his arm in a cast and he's been injured physically, and the guy next to him is literally tied into a bed and he's screaming, and I think that is quite brave, and probably quite shocking for people to see that happen. So for all it, and I know it's interesting because I remember you talking about Objective Burma with James a few weeks ago, and the press reaction in the UK about the Americans are kind of dramatising and it's not suitable for melodrama, and what about the British? Exactly the same kind of reaction to Big Parade. A lot of the local and national press were saying, This is Hollywood making money out of this experience, and it's not suitable for melodrama, and it doesn't represent what Britain's larger contribution to the war, because it was massively larger. So there's nothing new about that. I mean, so you could kind of trace the kind
of interesting.
Yeah, I mean the reaction was exactly the same right through to what was it, 571 or whatever it is, or the enigmas to me.
It always annoys me because I like to think that we should know better than to just blame what a country did in a war and then disparage their contribution to it.
Yeah,
I think it's so an odd thing to do, but to hear they were doing it even back then, it's when the Americans come into the First World War, they're really they're really useful to the war effort with manpower and material might and things, and it's a little bit disappointing to hear that people were annoyed by it even back then. You think because they're so close to the event, you think they perhaps would think of it differently, but it's so odd just to hear that they didn't.
Yeah, well, it's not. I don't know. It's kind of reassuring that people are still the same as they always were. People back in the 1920s are no different than they are now. And it's interesting because. Cinema is a commercial business. The Big Parade was produced in Hollywood, so it's going to have an American flavor. It's not pretending to be anything than it isn't. It's not. The Americans were very heavily involved. You see French soldiers. You see French soldiers coming back from the front. You see some dead bodies wearing Adrian helmets, and they're clearly identified as French. You don't see any British. It's not the part of the front we're involved in. The story doesn't involve British characters. I haven't got a beef with that at all, and there's no, the ridiculous scene in Saving Private Ryan when they're talking about how useless Montgomery is and all the rest of it. There's nothing like that, nothing that's saying we're coming over here to show these limeys how to fight this war or anything like that. There's nothing in that. I think it's a perfectly honourable film, and I think it succeeds, and I think
and I think somewhere along the way, the American involvement of the First World War sort of is put by the wayside.
Absolutely.
So, it's at least there's the Lost Battalion film, which I think is a hidden gem. Even now, it's a bit of a hidden gem.
I'd agree with that. Yeah,
their part of war is just as important as the rest of the countries. It's not something to be sort of sneered at.
Absolutely not. And the Americans went through exactly the same process we did. They had a tiny little army, which they grew into a massive citizen army. They didn't know how to fight initially, and they learned the hard way, just like we did. nicely onto Journey's End, which I think traces, the kind of development arc of how the war was shown in the cinema. And I don't think you could get a film like Journey's End appearing any time before talkies, because it's a film of a play and it's very talky, but also the subject matter and the depiction of the characters there is completely out of kilter with the guys, the heroic officers we talked about in the battle reconstruction films. A very famous play, first produced in 1927. R.C. Sheriff, he was a veteran himself. He served on the Western Front. And
Stalin's from Big Parade. Obviously. He was a Marine who lost a leg at
Bella Woods. Yeah, absolutely. So it has that authenticity, and I think anybody who's interested in the First World War, has to watch the Somme documentary, has to watch Journey's End. I mean, I've seen I saw it in Ypres a few years ago. Mesh Theatre Company did it, and it's in a small hut, very very close to it. It's a very claustrophobic play and film. It takes place mostly in a dugout.
Yeah, it is.
And it's incredibly intense, because these are people who are, reaching the end of their tether, particularly Stanhope, the main character. And it's because that proximity, you feel very close to what's happening. It feels incredibly claustrophobic. So what we're seeing, and within the confines of, I guess, British class structure, it's a very class conscious film. The main characters are all officers. Apart from the Sergeant Major, who I think is pretty credible, the other rank characters. Mason is their orderly and cook, and he's a kind of a comic character. And at one point they talk about him almost like he's too stupid to understand what he's experiencing. If he had a bit more sensibility like we did and a decent public school education, he'd understand how shit everything was. But.
They make him out, and he's flapping about like, "Oh, I'm sorry, sir. The order told me it was going to be pineapple, but it's apricot. I'm so sorry, sir." It's like
the worst things that happen to him.
Yeah, it's like he thinks he's going to be put on a charge because the tin of fruit's wrong. It's like, and it's all this like, "Calm down, it's okay." And he's like, "Well, I'll tell you, Uncle, and then you can tell Stanhope, and he won't be mad at me." It is that class thing, and Trotter's like common officer, everyman officer. I think he's my favourite character in any rendition of Journey's End. Yeah, he gets the best lines.
He does get the best lines. He's a man of uncertain accent. I mean, he's part Cockney, part Australian, part Dick Van Dyke.
Because was it Billy Bevan was Australian,
right? Yeah. I think that's kind of seeps through a little bit, but he's a very sympathetic character. But I think what you're seeing in this film is a much more cynical and weary view of the war than you'd seen in any of the previous films. The impact on the psyche of the participants is, when he comes through. I mean, Robert Clive, who plays Stanhope, is he's a really interesting. Sorry, Colin Clive. Yeah, he's a really interesting character. He was actually filmed in Hollywood at the time. James Whale was the director, and Whale and Clive went on to make Frankenstein the year after. And Clive had played Stanhope on stage in London in 1929, so he's familiar with the role, and he's a kind of bit of method acting going on there because he was a terrible alcoholic himself, and looked pretty much. You could probably do the role without makeup because he had that kind of drawn, slightly hysterical kind of demeanor, which he plays really really well, and it's a very stagey film. Again, we're not looking at anything dramatic. I think the external scenes with the trench raid and the final German attack is quite dramatic. That looks really good.
They're well done, aren't they?
I think
Very
so.
well
Absolutely. I mean, there's lots of sort of convincing artillery sort of going on, and very much a sense of peril, which the play built up to.
Coming into the trench at night, that's really well done. Like, I really like that. I know the age has not been kind to the print, but you can see what they're going for, and it's really well done. Echoes the 2017 film almost beat for
they're
beat.
very faithful to the source material, aren't they?
Very
Both films,
faithful.
really.
Yeah, and it's the contrasting scenes of the dugout then being outside, and it's, you know, that you feel safe in the dugout. Outside, you feel like you could be killed any minute. I don't know. There's just something about the 1931 that, I don't know, maybe feels more not natural. And I can't think of the word, but because these men would have known the war, the audience knows the war. It's only 20 years ago when it happened, and you know the Spring Offensive 1918 was so important. I know when we talked to Taff, you know, he was saying everyone in those theatres would know that date like the back of their hand because of how shocking it was when it happened.
Yeah,
and there's just something. Is that extra layer? You know, I always say about theirs is the glory and battleground and things like that. I know we always mention them, but there is the extra layer there because of the context of how these films are made and who makes them and who acts in them and the audience that views them. The movie, when it's made, is so much a part of the cultural context of its releasing period, if you know what I mean. If that makes any sense out of that.
100%. I mean, I think one of the things that all these films have in common is that everybody appearing in it would have had some personal connection with the war, would have remembered it, would have possibly have been in it, would have known somebody who'd been in it, would have known someone who died. And I think you're almost like, it's like a window into the past, you know, and it's captured on celluloid, and these people are expressing it. And I think for all its limitations, and I know Clive's performance at times is a bit kind of hysterical, and you know, but it's, you absolutely believe that this is a guy who is just hanging on by his fingernails, and has been places and has seen things that most people just wouldn't be able to stand. And there's a couple of scenes where he talks down Hibbert, who wants to go sick, and you know, one of my favourite, you know, speeches in, you know, when he said, you know, come on, old boy, you know, stick it out. What more can a decent man do? You know, it's incredibly moving. And I think at the end, when Raleigh's fatally wounded and he's brought down to the dugout, and you just see Stanhope change it literally changes. His voice changes, his facial expression changes. He becomes not this drunken, world-weary, cynical, and he becomes kind and soft, really, in a way, and his humanity returns to him. And I think that end scene where it's almost like a saying, you know, you could come through this and you could be destroyed as a human being, either physically or emotionally, but at the end, I guess the love for a fellow man and his friendship, you know, with Raleigh, he comes out and he you know, his humanity resurfaces again, you know, just before he's called back up to the trench and goes to his certain death, and the dugout becomes engulfed in smoke and it fades to darkness, you know, which we know is the end of the play. And you know, you don't need that kind of rubbing in that this is the end for all these guys. And I think for all its limitations as a piece of cinema, and you're right, the print I've seen isn't in great shape, and it could really do with the restoration job. I think it really works. Definitely. And for a lot of the points that you make, Robbie, about it having that closeness and connection, that authenticity, that for all this kind of technical superiority that the 2017 film had, I think there's something quite special about the 1931. And it's interesting because it just introduces a lot of themes about, you know, the film, depictions of the war that we'd see would become standard tropes. You know, the cynicism, the world weariness, the, you know, destruction to mind and spirit. You know, people hanging on for the sake of hanging on rather than, you know, to achieve heroic deeds. You know, the victory is hanging in there, you know, and that comes out time and time again in films that subsequently follow. And I guess to round it out, I think for me that it kind of marks a development of how cinema showed the war. Is that the 1920s had that period where, you know, we were mourning, we were commemorating, we were remembering. And there was a kind of unspoken pride about what had happened, and the films represented that. That's what we wanted to see. from 1930 onwards, when you get Journey's End, you get All Quiet on the Western Front coming out, West Front 1918, and all the films virtually that subsequently followed would just take a darker, more critical look at the war, and would then go on to shape, I think, how we felt about it and how we remembered the war, and what a public perception is for the majority of people. And I think that's incredibly interesting.
Because that was going to be a question I was going to ask you, Andy, from your research for your thesis and your research for your masters. How do you think these? I mean, maybe not perhaps these 4 movies we've talked about, but how do you think movies of that era that we've just talked about? Do you think they shape modern depictions, like, within the last maybe 20 years of the First World War? Do you think are they still relevant?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting. Silent cinema tends to get overlooked an awful lot. I mentioned Lawrence's book. Well, also Mark Connolly has written a great book called Celluloid War Memorials about the work of British instructional films. But what was so interesting about this is that, but why was that so impactful? What had happened before? And as like any good historian asks, well, how did we get here, and how did we arrive at the point where something could come along and challenge what our view was? And I think looking back at a lot of the films, particularly things like The Big Parade, it established a lot of tropes that continue. That connection with the individual in the midst of events that are outside of their control. Some of the visual tropes as well, the panoramic view of warfare. The marching boots that we see in Mons or what have you. The language of cinema was really developing, but developing fast. And in some ways, what we're getting now is just an evolution of what was there in I guess in essence way back in the late 20s, early 30s. So I think for me it's an important starting point, and to understand how we've got to where we are now. I think you've got to look back because these really deeply embedded cultural attitudes, they happen through establishing layers, like geology, and you don't change that culture overnight. It changes very, very slowly. And for me, this is why it's such an interesting subject, because I think cinema has been incredibly important in establishing that cultural legacy.
Yeah, that's why we do the pod. It is how we remember the past. It's just a fact. Whether you like it or not, it is good to go back and see this immediate post-war era, because cinema goes from showing the war in a grand scale, showing battles, to 1930 Journey's End, just showing men's experiences. It like scales down. It's that smaller view of men in war that I appreciate more than a very stylized depiction like 1917 had.
I couldn't agree more, really. I mean, I love spectacle as much as the next person. But I don't know who said it originally, but someone said like great drama is not what happens, it's who it happens to. And I think if you don't have that investment in the characters, and you actually care what happens to them, and you see the effect on events, the effect on them as individuals. You can have watch as many spectaculars as you like, but it doesn't really impact on you. And I think if you think about the things that really it affects you personally, it's because you identify with someone, because the personal experience is demonstrated there for you. You can share with it, you can empathize, you can experience emotionally in a way that I think you're right, Journey's End does. And perhaps some of the kind of reconstruction films or the spectaculars don't, because it's just things that are happening to other people. But if you know, like Jim or Slim or Bull in Big Parade, it's when those two guys die, this is somebody you've got to know, and it means something, and kind of loss has got to be the loss of something, not just a casualty figure, and it means something personal.
Yeah.
And certainly for people who'd experienced and lived through the First World War, for so many people it was incredibly personal. It wasn't just a list of casualties. It was very much an individual, a named person that you knew, And I think the way that the personal aspect of films that try and depict the individual gets that across, I think. And it's important for shaping how we feel about those, these kind of experiences.
I mean, Andy, that was incredible. We got through 4 films.
Oh my goodness.
We saw a little slice.
We've seen how Hollywood evolved.
Absolutely,
How it evolved. We really hope that you turn your thesis into some sort of book so we can all learn a bit more.
Well, maybe if I get that article in Sight and Sound, then that would do.
Once again, thanks, Andy, for joining us. It's absolutely fascinating. And if you'd like to find out more, please do check out our website, fightingonfilm.com. We are also on Facebook and Twitter. And if you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so through Patreon. Thank you again for joining us, Andy, and thanks for listening, everybody.